Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı bir ülkeden, farklı coğrafyalardan konuklar ağırlıyoruz ve farklı bir konuyu ele alıyoruz. Bugün de ünlü bir Amerikalı Osmanlı tarihçisi Jane Hathaway bizlerle olacak. Kendisinin kısa süre önce bir kitabı yayınlandı Türkçe. Kitap eski aslında, yeni bir kitap değil ama Türkçe çevirisi Vakıfbank Kültür Yayınları tarafından yeni çıktı. Beşir Ağa, Osmanlı Haremi'nin Baş Hadım Ağası kitabı. Hem bu kitabı konuşacağız bugün hem de Osmanlı tarihine dair pek çok konuyu süremiz yettiğince konuşmaya çalışacağız. Ohio State Üniversitesi Tarih Bölümü öğretim üyesi Profesör Doktor Jane Hathaway bizlerle. Hocam merhabalar, hoş geldiniz yayınımıza.
Hoş bulduk.
Nasılsınız?
Çok teşekkürler ilginize.
Nasılsınız hocam?
Ben iyiyim, siz nasılsınız?
Teşekkür ederim. Sizi görmek, burada ağırlamak çok güzel.
Ben de çok güzel.
Okay, Professor, I will ask my questions in English, so I'm not going to challenge you anymore.
Good. Yes, speaking on one's feet is always difficult.
Yeah, it is. I mean, especially if you don't practice much, it is always difficult. So, Professor, first of all, congratulations for the translation of your book on Beşir Ağa in Turkish. I just read it. I finished reading it last weekend. So I will come to the book. I will come to that book later. But first, I would like to talk about the Arab lands under the Ottoman rule, which is the title of your another book, I guess. Your research focuses on the the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, including Egypt and Yemen. So I want to ask you first the nature of the Ottoman administration in these provinces. How did it differ from one another and from other non-Arab provinces?
Right. First of all, I should clarify that this was my previous research before my recent book on the chief harem eunuch in general, which came out in 2018. So before that project, I was working mainly on Egypt and Yemen as it pertained to Egypt. So what I'll say is related to Ottoman provincial administration generally, not just Egypt and Yemen. The basic difference in provincial administration comes down to how taxes were collected, because the Ottoman Empire was one of history's great tax collecting empires. So in the provinces that were conquered or incorporated into the empire before roughly 1517, you had a form of land administration known as the Tımar, and I took the liberty of preparing this little flashcard. Mm-hmm. The Tımar it's often called a military fief. What it consists of is a system in which a military commander received not the land itself, because the state owned the land, but the right to collect taxes on a portion of land. And with these revenues, he equipped a certain number of horsemen for the Sultan's army. Now, this system made sense for an empire whose army relied heavily on cavalry and whose economy was not entirely monetized. After 1517, the provinces incorporated then, mainly under Suleiman, after the conquest by Selim I, his father, and these would include Egypt, Yemen, the North African provinces, and Baghdad and Basra, southern Iraq, had a different kind of administration known as Salyane, which literally means tribute. And so the Tımar system did not really operate in those provinces. Instead, the armies were paid cash salaries from the state or provincial treasury, and this actually made sense in an empire in which infantry was becoming more and more important to the imperial armies, and the economy was more and more completely monetized, meaning trade and tax collection was done in cash. You know, you could no longer pay your taxes by giving crops or livestock or anything like that. Mm-hmm. I'll just say the last point on tax collection. In most of these provinces, taxes ultimately came to be collected through what's called a tax farm, meaning a kind of outsourcing or privatization, whereby a military commander or a wealthy official of some kind buys the right to collect taxes and pays up front. So in other words, the government is selling its risk. It has the money up front. these officials take on the responsibility for tax collection. So that's the major difference.
Okay, interesting. Professor, well, I think it's quite impossible to understand the history of these provinces without understanding the Ottoman history and its institutions. So how do you think the Ottoman rule has shaped today's modern Middle East in general?
Right, you're absolutely right that it's not possible to understand either the history or the modern reality of the Middle East, and I would say the Balkans and Turkey as well, without understanding Ottoman history, because these territories were part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. The Balkans from the 14th century through the early 19th, depending on the individual nation state, and the Arab lands from the 16th century, in some cases through to the collapse of the empire. How Ottoman rule has shaped the modern Middle East. I think the main thing I would say is that Ottoman rule created a kind of Pax Ottomanica. In other words, a large swath of territory stretching at its height in the mid-16th century from the borders of Hungary to Ethiopia, north to south, and from the borders of Morocco in the west to the borders of Iran in the east. And this territory under a common rule allowed for the movement of people, goods, ideas, customs, food, language, music. I can say more about people, but maybe you'd like to move on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, surely, but you can go on.
Oh, okay. So the kinds of people who moved from the imperial capital, Istanbul, to the provinces would be officials and administrators and military commanders. They didn't just move from Istanbul to the provinces, they moved from one province to another. And in addition to them, you have soldiers, merchants, scholars or ulama, pilgrims, people making the Hajj to Mecca, for example. You also have populations fleeing hostile rule who came into Ottoman territory, and by far the most famous example of that would be the Jewish population expelled from Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1497, in addition to Muslim populations expelled from the same territory later.
Right. Well, speaking of the Ottoman rule in the Arab lands, especially in particular, Professor, many Arabs and also Westerners see it negatively as an invasion or occupation, blaming the Ottoman period of the contemporary problems of the region. I wonder, what is your take on such claims?
I'm familiar with those claims. I would say they're fortunately more or less obsolete in most Arab countries today, and particularly where intellectuals and academics are concerned. In the past, let's say 40 years or so, we've seen a rethinking of the Ottoman period by Arab intellectuals and academics in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, for example, in which today the period of Ottoman rule is seen as an integral part of these countries' history. It is not seen as some kind of 400-year Turkish yoke that held back the would-be nation states from realizing their glory. It's seen as a period when the cities of the Arab lands expanded, grew in population, when trade entered a new phase, as a period of development, although not some kind of rosy utopia. And again, the thinking among these academics is not that they want the Ottomans back and want to be part of the empire again, but it's simply a more balanced view of the role it plays in their history. Another thing I'll say is that in the past 10 or 15 years, and this particularly struck me when I was working on the second edition of the Arab lands under Ottoman rule, there's been a real engagement on the part of my colleagues in Egypt, in Lebanon, to some extent in Syria, given the horrors and the disruption of the civil war, with secondary literature, scholarship on the Ottoman center and on the Balkans. And what I would say is that it's far more common today for a scholar in Cairo or in Beirut to read about events in Istanbul or Sofia in the Ottoman period than it is for scholars in Istanbul or in the Balkans to read scholarship on the Arab provinces.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Professor, one of the most famous and controversial, I would say, periods of the Ottoman history is the so-called Lale Devri. So the dominant narrative in Turkey is negative of that period, generally portraying it as a manifestation of the Ottoman decline. So what is your opinion of that period? How would you define this period in the broader Ottoman history? And did it have any long-lasting consequences for the rest of the history, for the rest of the Ottoman history, and even for the Republic?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, just defining the Lale Devri, or tulip period. It was a term coined, or popularized, I should say, by the early Republican Turkish intellectual Ahmed Refik. Apparently, the first person to utter it was Yahya Kemal, the famous poet and intellectual. Mm-hmm. And it does conjure up this vision of conspicuous consumption and decadence, particularly because the period really starts in 1718, right after a humiliating defeat of the Ottoman Empire by the Habsburg Empire and the signing of the Treaty of Passarowitz, which, among other things, forced the Ottomans to give up Belgrade to the Habsburgs. So it's seen as, like, after this horrible defeat, Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha and their courtiers just forget all about it and party on the banks of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn while importing huge caches of European luxury goods like mirrors and clocks. The reality is a little bit more nuanced. This was, for one thing, a period. It's the second part of the reign of Ahmed III, 1718 to 1730, when the court had only recently moved back to Istanbul after decades in Edirne. So Istanbul really becomes the focus of attention again. Its population grows, its territorial extent grows. These new palaces and pleasure pavilions where these lavish parties take place are constructed or at least renewed during this period. So this is the period when famous palaces like Churahan and Sadabad are constructed or restored. Another thing is that it's an era when the Ottoman economy is really booming. It's recovered from the 17th century crisis. It's expanding, and that's what makes the importation of these luxury goods possible. It's also a period of peace, at least with the Habsburgs, and one in which diplomacy is stressed more than it ever has been before. A period when you have effendis, bureaucrats, like the Reis al-Kutab, taking the leadership in negotiating with the Habsburgs and other powers. So the era when military commanders really dominated the government and foreign policy is not entirely over, of course, but there's a greater degree of participation by bureaucrats. And I think that is a long-term trend in Ottoman history, the idea that you can live peacefully with European powers and other powers, and that you can engage with them mainly by diplomacy. I guess if you wanted to, you could say that new attitude in some ways very indirectly informs the early Republican and current ethos of peace at home and peace abroad.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, Professor, well, I want to come to this book now because time is almost up. I mean, we have, I think, 10 minutes left, so I want to talk about the book as well. So what was the case for Beşir Ağa, Professor? What makes him special? I mean, as a baş hadım ağası, and there were other hadım ağa in Saray, let's say, in the palace. So what makes him special? And also, I will also, of course, ask some questions about the famous harem in the Saray. But first, please explain us why this guy was special and unique. What made them different than the others?
Well, I hate to dash your hopes, but I really don't think he was all that much of an anomaly as chief harem eunuchs go. I wrote the biography because the late Patricia Krona, the eminent scholar of early Islamic history, asked me. She was editing a series of makers of the Muslim world, biographies of great Muslim figures throughout Islamic history, and she asked me if I had a figure I could contribute, and I suggested Hacı Beşir Ağa. What sets him apart is that he was the longest serving chief harem eunuch, or Darüsaray Ağası, to use the Ottoman title. 29 years from 1717 to 1746. The only other aga or chief harem eunuch who comes close is Haja Mustafa Aga in the early 17th century. He continued a number of already established patterns among chief harem eunuchs. For example, founding charitable foundations all over the empire, everything from his kuliye in Istanbul, in Jalolu, to a Quran school in Cairo, to a lighthouse in Sulina, Romania, right on the Black Sea. He also collected books, which was another established chief harem eunuch pattern. His library became the basis of two separate collections at Süleymaniye Kütüphanesi today.
Oh, okay.
He also discovered, in quotation marks, Evliya Çelebi's famous Seyahatname in Cairo and had it brought to Istanbul and recopied. So in a sense, he introduced the Seyahatname to a broader Ottoman readership. And two other things, like the first chief harem eunuch, Habeshi Mehmed Ağa, under Murad III, he seems to have been closely tied to the imperial painting studio that turned out these incredible illustrated surnames and other works celebrating court functions. And lastly, like Haja Mustafa Ağa, he's buried in Eyüp Cemetery right next to Abu Ayyub Ansari himself.
Well, very interesting, yeah. Well, Professor Beşir Ağa, as well as the others, lived and worked in Osmanlı haremi, in the Ottoman harem. And surely the Ottoman harem has been a great matter of speculation for historians, novelists, painters, and also filmmakers. So between imaginary and reality, how would you describe harem, its role and mission in the Ottoman history? And of course, I will ask you, have you ever watched the TV series Muhteşem Yüzyıl, Harim Sultan, or what was it called in English? The Magnificent Century. Yes.
In the U.S.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll start with the second question. I watched the whole thing, both Muhteşem Yüzyıl and Muhteşem Yüzyıl Kösem. It is addictive. Once you start watching, you want to figure out how it turns out. That said, the reality of the harem was much more boring, which is why they had to spice it up for television. The purpose of the Ottoman harem really was to reproduce the dynasty. That is, to make sure that when the current sultan died, there would be a crown prince ready, or at least in preparation, to succeed him as sultan. And in that context, the harem functioned according to a very rigid set of rules of seniority, age-based seniority among both the women who lived there and the eunuchs who guarded the harem, and strict rules of behavior. So most of the women who lived there were actually not candidates to be the sultan's concubine wife or the mother of future sultan. They were functionaries, everything from laundresses and cooks to nurses to accountants to aides to the sultan's mother and the hasakis and so on. So they lived like nuns, really. They were celibate. Only a tiny fraction of these women were eligible to become the sultan's concubine. So I tell my students, if you were a concubine or if you were a young girl who moved into the sultan's harem, it would be like moving into a girls' dormitory at college run by your mother-in-law. It was hardly glamorous or erotic. Getting back to Muhteşem Yüzyıl, of course, the first thing I noticed is that there were no African eunuchs at all. And Beşir Aga and virtually all of the other chief harem eunuchs beginning in the late 16th century were from East Africa. Ethiopia, Nubia, Sudan, etc. There was only one, Gulbahar Sultan's eunuch in Muhteşem Yüzyıl Kösem. And that guy probably bore very little resemblance. The actor bore little resemblance to what an actual chief eunuch would have looked like. You know, he was this tall, vigorous, deep-voiced, handsome man. All the other eunuchs were, well, I guess I would say white, but not African. Of course, some of the characterizations. I love Sunbullah. Everybody loves Sunbullah. Otherwise, the amount of contact that Hürrem and the other inhabitants of the harem had with men was unrealistic. Like the idea that Hurrem Sultan would have met Ibrahim Pasha in person, I doubt that she ever did. And she would certainly never run into him while walking along a corridor. That would not happen.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, for sure, it was not 100%, portrayed correctly, and there are so many mistakes.
But I don't mean to say that it was completely made up. I think a couple of things it did get across well, the kind of restricted space and the amount of guarding that was done in the harem. What really struck me, whenever anyone had to leave a room, you would have to knock on the door to get out as well as in. You couldn't just come and go as you pleased. And the other thing, and as someone who teaches Islamic history, this really struck a chord. I think it did a good job of portraying Islam as just an integral and ordinary part of people's lives. You know, it's just part of daily routine.
But interesting that you watched all episodes, Professor, huh? You finished it.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I admit it.
Well, I did also watch it, of course, but not, I think, maybe half of it. I mean, I didn't finish that, but yeah, I mean, it was fun to watch anyway.
Yeah,
so,
very much.
Yeah. So, Professor, my next question will go beyond your field of expertise. I'm warning you. So, Turkey's relations with the Arab Middle East has always been a topic of intense debates in Turkey. Some see the Ottoman past as facilitating the relations. Some see it as toxic. So I was wondering your point of view. How did this Ottoman past affect or influence, let's say, Turkey's historical and current relations with the Middle East today?
That's a big and very complicated question. I mean, I think the fact that the Ottoman Empire existed in this territory for so many centuries, it's always there in the background. I think it is important to remember that all of these countries, in the Balkans as well, not just Turkey, are the successor states to the Ottoman Empire. And that's something that the Arab countries, if not so much the Balkan countries, are maybe finding their way to seeing. On the other hand, there is, I would say, there has historically been a certain wariness of Turkey, not only as the center of the old empire, but also today as one of the largest countries in the region, one of the most populous, by far and away the strongest and largest economy. That's very obvious if you go to any of the Arab countries today and you just look at the number of Turkish consumer items, construction equipment, etc., that are imported.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a NATO member. It has the second largest army in NATO after the US. And I guess historically, there's been some wariness about Turkish overreach or the potential for Turkish overreach in the region. I think for that reason, the early Turkish Republic, to the extent I know, and I'm not an expert on that period, took some pains to stress that it was not the defunct Ottoman Empire, and that it too, like most of the Arab countries, had suffered from European, mainly British and French, also Russian imperialism. The last thing I'll say on that point is that glorifying the Ottoman past in the Arab countries, and in Israel too, for that matter, can be a way of criticizing the current government.
Yeah, true. Right. Yeah.
I mean, the current governments in those various countries.
Yeah, right. Professor, do you see a so-called threat, let's say, of neo-Ottomanism? I mean, there is such thing called neo-Ottomanism, and it will come back, as most of the Western analysts argue.
Well, I think what we have to remember today is that neo-Ottomanism, not just on Turkey's part, but potentially on the part of the Arab countries, maybe even Israel, the Balkan countries, it's a matter of how these countries, very much including Turkey, appropriate and reimagine the Ottoman Empire for themselves today. It doesn't really have much directly to do with actual Ottoman history. It's kind of a way of bringing the past up to justify your current foreign policy, to rationalize it, to frame your position with the rest of the region. So I think we have to see it in that context and kind of in this strange and frightening context we find ourselves in today with the Middle East, in so many countries in crisis for various reasons, so much uncertainty, so much territorial change and tension.
I see. Well, time is up, Professor, but I just want to ask you one final question. Do you watch other TV series about the Ottoman history? Because we have a lot in recent years.
Yeah.
So Diriliş Ertuğrul, for example, I don't know the others, but do you watch any other series, or soap operas or movies, historical ones?
I started watching Ertuğrul. I have not finished it, and I watched the short Fatih series. Actually, I watched both of them, the older one and the newer one.
Okay.
It's very interesting that this is so popular, and of course it's popular all over the world.
Yeah, it is.
Except really in the United States and Canada.
Oh, okay.
But in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Interesting. So in our next interview, then we will talk about, when you finish all episodes, we will talk about the other TV soap operas like Diriliş Ertuğrul and others then, Professor.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
Okay, çok teşekkür ederim hocam. Thank you very much, Professor.
Ben de teşekkür ederim. Thank you.
Sizi ağırlamak çok güzeldi. İstanbul'a geldiğinizde bir kahve içeriz umarım, bir Türk kahvesi içeriz.
İnşallah içeriz.
İnşallah. Çok teşekkür ediyorum Profesör. Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşmek üzere. Hoşça kalın.
Hoşça kalın. Evet, Amerikalı ünlü Osmanlı tarihçisi Jane Hathaway ile konuştuk. Hem Türkçe'ye çevrilen yeni kitabı Beşir Ağa kitabını böyle bir kere daha göstermiş olalım. Vakıfbank Kültür Yayınları'ndan çıktı Türkçesi kısa bir süre önce. Hem de genel bir Osmanlı tarihinde şöyle bir turlamış olduk. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuda, farklı bir konukla karşınızda olmak dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.